The wind howled across the jagged rocks, and the waves crashed violently against the shore as the lighthouse stood tall, its light piercing through the thickening fog. It had been a night like any other, yet something felt different, something ominous, as if the darkness itself had a secret to reveal. At the top of the lighthouse, its beacon flashing intermittently, a body lay lifeless, sprawled out on the cold stone floor. It was the death of a man who had lived alone in this isolated place for years. But how did he end up dead, and who could have committed such a chilling act? The lighthouse, once a symbol of safety for sailors navigating treacherous waters, now stood as the scene of a gruesome crime, a mystery no one had seen coming. The small coastal town at the foot of the lighthouse was rattled. Gossip spread through the tight-knit community, and the sheriff's office, already stretched thin, was left grappling for answers. No one could remember the last time something like this had happened, but no one could deny the truth either. The death was not an accident. It was murder. This is where the story begins. Enter Detective Clara Evans, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp mind and even sharper instincts. She had solved countless cases, but nothing quite like this. The quiet, isolated lighthouse had always been a place of solace for Clara, a reminder of her own past. But now it was the scene of a deadly puzzle, and every clue she uncovered only seemed to deepen the mystery. What could have happened in that cold, lonely tower? Why was the victim there? And what connection did he have to the townspeople? As Clara pieced together the fragments of the case, the answers seemed more elusive than ever. The dead man's identity was the first twist. No one knew him. No one had seen him in town for weeks. His presence at the lighthouse seemed entirely out of place. Was he a stranger? Or was there something more? Something hidden behind a facade of normalcy? The townspeople were tight-lipped, as if they knew more than they were willing to admit. But who could be trusted when everyone seemed to be hiding something? There were whispers of old rivalries, unresolved grudges, and secrets buried deep in the past. The lighthouse, it seemed, had witnessed more than just the passage of ships. It had stood as a silent witness to the lives of those who lived in its shadow. And now, that silence was broken by the violent death of one of its visitors. Clara's investigation led her to a series of strange occurrences, all of which pointed to a hidden truth. But with every piece of the puzzle she uncovered, the deeper the conspiracy seemed to go. Could this be the work of someone from outside the town? Or was the killer someone they all knew, someone who had lived among them for years, hiding in plain sight? Then, just when Clara thought she was getting closer to the truth, a new piece of evidence came to light, one that changed everything. The lighthouse itself was a witness to the crime, its flashing light signaling something more than just the coming of dawn. There were traces of something unusual, something that shouldn't have been there. Was the lighthouse trying to communicate a warning, or was it a signal that something darker was at play? Clara's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place, but she wasn't prepared for the chilling twist that would follow. As the investigation took a dangerous turn, Clara found herself at the center of a web of lies, deceit, and hidden agendas. She had trusted people who were not what they appeared, and now her own life was in danger. Someone knew she was getting too close to the truth, and they were willing to do anything to stop her. But as the clock ticked and the storm outside raged on, Clara couldn't back down. The lighthouse might hold the key to unlocking the mystery, but she was beginning to realize that it could also be the very place where she would meet her own untimely end. The questions hung in the air. Who killed the man at the lighthouse? What secrets had the lighthouse been guarding for so long? And most importantly, what did it all mean for the future of this small coastal town? And for Clara Evans herself? As she stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, staring at the flickering light of the lighthouse, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous was waiting to be uncovered. With the storm closing in and the town's darkest secrets beginning to surface, the truth was within reach. But was she prepared to face it? The mysteries surrounding the death at the lighthouse were far from solved, and the real danger was only just beginning. Clara stood motionless at the base of the lighthouse, the wind biting at her face, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks beneath her feet filled the air. The storm had intensified, and the cold fog seemed to creep closer, thickening around the lighthouse like a shroud. The flashes of lightning illuminated the towering structure in brief, jagged bursts, casting long, unnatural shadows on the cliffs. As the light from the beacon cut through the night, Clara's thoughts were a swirl of confusion, unease, and frustration. She knew she was missing something big, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Turning away from the lighthouse, Clara glanced back toward the small town below. The streets were eerily quiet, for a place that had always been bustling with activity. People had begun to whisper in hushed tones, their curiosity and fear palpable. Word had spread like wildfire after the discovery of the body, and soon the entire town was consumed by the mystery of the man's death. But despite the speculation, the townspeople were tight-lipped, almost too quiet. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were all hiding something. Her mind kept returning to the victim, an anonymous man who had apparently arrived at the lighthouse just days before his death. His identity remained a mystery. No one in town recognized him, and there were no records of him ever having been in the area before. His clothes, though worn, were well kept, and there was no sign of struggle in the room where he was found. But there was something about the way he had died that didn't sit right. The marks on his neck were too deliberate, too controlled. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It felt personal, as if someone had intended to send a message. Clara shivered at the thought and rubbed her hands together for warmth. She had to keep moving, had to find answers. She couldn't let the mystery slip away into the fog, just like the man's life had. But she also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something far more sinister was lurking beneath the surface. The lighthouse keeper, Harold Marks, had been the one to discover the body. He was a man of few words, and Clara knew that his demeanor didn't help her trust him. The old man had lived alone in the lighthouse for years, and though he was friendly enough when he chose to speak, Clara had always sensed that there was more to him than met the eye. He was one of the few people in town who could have possibly known the man, yet Harold claimed he hadn't seen anyone at the lighthouse in weeks. His alibi seemed solid enough, but something about his hesitation when she asked him about the body raised Clara's suspicions. As she walked back toward her car, Clara pulled out her notebook and jotted down a few notes. She had interviewed the townspeople earlier, but everyone seemed to know less than they should. People avoided talking about the lighthouse and its history, as if the place itself carried a dark shadow. She'd heard rumors from locals about strange events that had occurred over the years, some of which had never been explained. Accidents, disappearances, and even a fire that nearly destroyed the lighthouse decades ago, though it had mysteriously been put out before it could cause any significant damage. Her thoughts drifted back to that strange clue she'd found earlier, a piece of torn fabric that had been wedged into the cracks of the lighthouse door. It wasn't much, but it was something. The fabric was unlike anything she had seen before, dark and coarse, yet it had a certain sheen to it, as though it had been carefully crafted. The design was unusual, almost too elegant for the rough environment of the lighthouse. She couldn't place it, but it was enough to make her wonder if the victim had been more than just a random stranger. Clara's next stop was the town's small library, where the old town records were kept. She had already spoken to the sheriff, who had been less than helpful, and now she needed answers that no one else seemed willing to provide. The library's librarian, Mrs. Mabel Dawson, was a sweet woman in her late 60s, but Clara knew she had a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. She might not have known the victim, but she certainly knew the secrets hidden within the walls of the lighthouse and the people who had lived there over the years. As Clara entered the library, the musty smell of old books and dust filled her lungs. Mrs. Dawson was behind the front desk, humming softly to herself as she flipped through a stack of papers. She looked up with a start when Clara entered, her glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose. "Detective Evans, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with concern. "I'm looking for any records on the lighthouse and its past inhabitants," Clara replied, her tone polite but firm. "I need to understand more about its history, anything that could be relevant to the case." Mrs. Dawson hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll see what I can find, though I warn you, the lighthouse has been the center of many strange happenings over the years. People have come and gone, but not all of them left on good terms. Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean by that? Oh, it's nothing, really, Mrs. Dawson said, her voice trailing off. Just some stories you'd rather not think about. But if you're determined to learn the truth, I can show you the old journals. Some of them have information that might surprise you. With that, Mrs. Dawson led Clara to the back of the library, where a collection of worn journals sat on shelves, their pages yellowed with age. Each one chronicled a different period in the lighthouse's history, and Clara carefully pulled one from the shelf, its leather cover cracked and faded. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes were drawn to a strange entry dated over 50 years ago, during the time when the fire had nearly destroyed the lighthouse. The entry described an eerie occurrence that had taken place late one stormy night. Voices had been heard coming from the lighthouse, though no one had been inside at the time. Some claimed to have seen figures in the windows, but when they went to investigate, the lighthouse was empty. Others swore that the keeper, who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after, had left behind a series of cryptic letters. The letters were never found, but the stories persisted, growing more bizarre with each retelling. Clara's heart raced. Could the mystery of the death at the lighthouse be connected to these long-forgotten events? Was it possible that the answers she was looking for were buried in the past, hidden by those who had lived there before? The wind outside howled, and Clara could hear the faint sounds of thunder in the distance. She looked up from the journal, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. Something was wrong, and she was getting closer to finding out just what it was. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she was seeking would come at a much greater cost than she had anticipated. Clara closed the journal slowly, her fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. The storm outside raged on, the wind screaming through the cracks in the library's old windows. Something about the entry she'd read stuck with her, as if the lighthouse itself had become a character in the story, a silent observer of human tragedy and mystery. Could the strange events of the past be tied to the death she was now investigating? Was the victim somehow connected to those long-buried secrets? She glanced toward Mrs. Dawson, who was busy sorting through a stack of other journals. The librarian's demeanor had changed slightly, her earlier warmth replaced with a subtle unease. Clara didn't miss the way her hands trembled as she passed over certain books, skipping over them as though even touching them might awaken something best left undisturbed. "Mrs. Dawson," Clara said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You mentioned stories about the lighthouse, things people don't like to talk about. Do you know anything more? Anything that might help me understand what's going on?" The older woman hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She looked around the library, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in closer. "Detective, you have to understand, this town has its share of secrets. The lighthouse has always been at the center of them. People don't like to talk about it because it brings up things we'd rather forget." "What kind of things?" Clara pressed, lowering her voice to match Mrs. Dawson's. "There's an old story," the librarian began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say the lighthouse is cursed, that anyone who stays there too long, well, they don't leave the same way they came. The keeper before Harold Marks, do you know what happened to him?" Clara shook her head, her pulse quickening. "He disappeared one night," Mrs. Dawson continued. "No trace, no explanation. Some say he walked into the sea, others think he ran away. But there were rumors, whispers of strange lights, voices, things that didn't make sense. And now, with this new death, I can't help but wonder if it's happening again." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't believe in curses, but the weight of the librarian's words was hard to ignore. Could there be something about the lighthouse that drove people to madness? Or was it simply a convenient scapegoat for the town's darker truths? She thanked Mrs. Dawson and left the library, clutching the journal tightly. As she stepped out into the storm, the rain hit her like icy needles, soaking her coat within seconds. The streets were deserted, the town's usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling silence. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though every time she turned, there was nothing but empty windows and shadowy doorways. Her next stop was Harold Mark's modest home, a small, weathered cabin on the edge of town. Harold had been cooperative during their first conversation, but Clara knew she hadn't pushed him hard enough. There was something about the way he'd avoided her questions, the way his eyes darted toward the lighthouse whenever he spoke, that made her certain he was holding back. The cabin was dark when she arrived, but Harold answered the door after a few knocks, his face creased with irritation. He looked older than his years, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the storm, or something far heavier, was pressing down on him. "Detective," he said gruffly, stepping aside to let her in. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Clara didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Harold, I need you to be honest with me. You said you didn't know the man who died at the lighthouse, but are you sure about that? Is there anything at all, that you haven't told me?" Harold hesitated, his weathered hands gripping the back of a chair. For a moment, Clara thought he might refuse to answer, but then he let out a heavy sigh and sank into the chair. "I didn't know him," he said, his voice low. "Not personally, anyway, but I'd seen him before, a few times. He'd come to the lighthouse late at night, always looking around, like he was searching for something. I asked him what he was doing, but he never gave me a straight answer, just said he had business to take care of." "What kind of business?" Clara asked, leaning forward. Harold shook his head. "I don't know, he never told me. But the last time I saw him, he looked scared, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain." Clara frowned. "Did he ever mention anyone else? Someone he might have been meeting?" "No," Harold said quickly, but his eyes darted away, betraying his unease. "I didn't want to get involved. The lighthouse. It's not a place you ask too many questions about. It's better that way." Clara's patience was wearing thin. "Harold, if you know something that could help me solve this case, you need to tell me. A man is dead, and the truth isn't going to stay buried forever." For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "There's something I didn't tell you," he admitted. "The night before the man was found dead, I saw something strange. A light, but not from the beacon. It was coming from the cliffs below the lighthouse, flickering like a signal. I thought it might have been kids messing around, but now I'm not so sure." Clara's mind raced. A light from the cliffs? Could it have been a signal? Or perhaps something more sinister? She needed to investigate, but the storm made it impossible to see anything clearly tonight. As she left Harold's cabin, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping deeper into a labyrinth, each clue leading her further from the surface. The storm had eased slightly, but the air felt heavier, charged with tension. She turned her gaze toward the lighthouse, its silhouette stark against the darkened sky. There was a story here, buried beneath layers of fear, secrets, and lies. Clara was determined to uncover it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap. The storm had quieted to a steady drizzle by the time Clara parked her car at the edge of the cliffs. The lighthouse loomed above her, its rotating beacon slicing through the fog like a warning. The faint sound of waves crashing against the rocks below echoed in the stillness, and for a moment she stood frozen, staring into the darkness. Harold's words replayed in her mind, the strange light, flickering from the cliffs. If it had been a signal, who had sent it? And for whom? Clara tightened her grip on the flashlight and started toward the lighthouse, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and seaweed, and every shadow seemed alive, shifting and stretching in her peripheral vision. She wasn't easily frightened. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't just the mystery of the man's death or the cryptic stories about the lighthouse. It was the silence, the kind that wasn't natural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She reached the base of the lighthouse and paused, scanning the area. The cliffs below were shrouded in mist, but she could make out the faint glimmer of water far beneath her. She played the beam of her flashlight across the ground, looking for any sign of what Harold had described. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but there were faint disturbances in the mud, tracks leading toward a narrow, almost hidden path that descended toward the cliffs. Clara hesitated. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough to walk on, and one wrong step could send her plunging into the sea. But if the light Harold had seen was real, it might be the key to unraveling this mystery. Taking a deep breath, she started down the path, her flashlight guiding her way. The descent was slow and nerve-wracking. The wind whipped at her coat, and the sound of the waves grew louder with each step. She could feel the spray of salt water on her face as she reached the bottom, where the ground leveled out into a narrow strip of rocky shore. She stopped to catch her breath, scanning her surroundings. The cliffs towered above her, jagged and imposing, and the lighthouse beacon seemed impossibly far away now. And then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible through the mist. It was coming from a small cave nestled into the base of the cliffs. Clara's heart raced as she approached, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the wet rocks. The light flickered again, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was waiting for her. She stopped just outside the cave, pressing herself against the cold, damp rock. The air was filled with the sound of dripping water and the distant crash of waves, but she could also hear something else, movement. Someone was inside. Clara peered around the edge of the cave's opening, her flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. Inside, the flickering light came from an old lantern resting on a makeshift table. The cave was larger than she'd expected, its walls covered in strange markings that looked like they'd been scratched into the stone. At the center of the room, a figure stood with their back to her, hunched over the table. They were moving quickly, their hands working on something Clara couldn't see. She drew her weapon, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Stop right there," she called out, stepping into the cave. "Turn around, slowly." The figure froze, then turned to face her. It was a man, his face gaunt and his eyes wild with fear. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes disheveled and soaked from the rain. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, keeping her gun trained on him. "What are you doing here?" The man raised his hands, his voice trembling. "Please, you don't understand. I'm not the one you're looking for. I didn't kill him." "Then who did?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. "And what are you doing in this cave?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the markings on the walls. It's the lighthouse," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something wrong with it, something unnatural. I came here to stop it." Clara frowned, lowering her weapon slightly. "Stop what?" "The signal," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It's not just a light, it's a message. It's been calling people here for years, drawing them in. I don't know why, but they don't come back." Clara's mind raced. Could this man be telling the truth? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle, caught up in the same web of fear and paranoia that seemed to surround the lighthouse? Before she could press him further, a sudden noise made them both freeze. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the earth itself was shifting beneath them. The man's face went pale, and he grabbed the lantern, backing toward the far wall of the cave. "It's coming," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You shouldn't have come here." Clara turned toward the cave entrance, her weapon raised, but there was nothing there, only the endless darkness of the cliffs and the faint glow of the lighthouse beacon above. The rumbling grew louder, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate. She could feel the tension building, like the air before a storm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The cave was silent again, but the air felt charged, as if something unseen had passed through. The man lowered the lantern, his hands trembling. "You have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The lighthouse, it's not just a building. It's alive." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was far stranger and far darker than she'd ever imagined. The lighthouse wasn't just the scene of a crime. It was the heart of something much bigger, something that had been lurking in the shadows for years. As she stepped back toward the cave entrance, her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering in the damp air. She felt a chill run down her spine as the light from the beacon above seemed to grow brighter, its rhythmic flashes casting eerie shadows on the cliffs. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't over, and Clara knew that the answers she sought would come at a cost she might not be ready to pay. Clara stood at the mouth of the cave, staring up at the lighthouse as its beacon flashed again, illuminating the cliffs in stark, ghostly light. The man's words echoed in her mind. "It's alive!" Her rational instincts rejected the idea, but something deep within her, a primal sense she couldn't fully explain, warned her that she was on the edge of understanding something terrifying. She turned back to the man, her grip on the flashlight tightening. "You're going to have to explain what you mean," Clara said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Start from the beginning. What is this place, and what's going on with the lighthouse?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the markings on the cave walls. He seemed torn, as if saying too much might doom them both. Finally, he exhaled shakily, setting the lantern on the ground between them. Its light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across his face. "They built it in the wrong place," he said. "The lighthouse. Decades ago, they ignored warnings, old maps, legends. The cliffs were marked as dangerous, not just because of the rocks, but because of something older, something that doesn't belong here." Clara frowned, her skepticism returning. "You're telling me this is about cursed land? That's a little hard to believe." "It's not a curse," the man snapped, his desperation cutting through his fear. "It's something worse, something ancient, and it's waking up." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Clara didn't believe in myths or supernatural forces, but she couldn't ignore the growing weight of unease that had followed her since she'd arrived in this town. And the look in the man's eyes, wild, yes, but also full of a raw, unshakable truth, made her pause. "Why now?" she asked finally. "If this thing has been here all along, why is it waking up now?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it's the storms, or maybe it's because people keep disturbing it. You saw the victim, didn't you? The man who died? He was looking for something. He was down here, digging where he shouldn't have been." Clara's heart raced. "Digging for what?" "Whatever's buried under this cliff," the man said. "Whatever the lighthouse was built to hide." The sound of thunder rolled overhead, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the rocks beneath their feet. Clara turned back to the cave entrance, scanning the cliffs for any sign of movement. The storm was picking up again, and the rain had returned, a steady drizzle that blurred the edges of her vision. "I need to see this for myself," she said, motioning toward the cave walls. "What are these markings? Do they have something to do with what's buried here?" The man hesitated, but finally nodded, stepping closer to the walls. He traced one of the crude symbols with his finger, a spiral that seemed to ripple outward, almost alive under the lantern's flickering light. "These were left by the first keepers," he explained. "Or so the stories go. Warnings. They wanted people to know what this place really is. But over time, people stopped listening. They just saw the lighthouse as a landmark, a way to guide ships. They didn't see the danger." Clara studied the symbols, her mind racing. Could the man be right? Could the lighthouse's history be tied to something far older and darker than anyone had realized? And if so, what had the victim found or unleashed that led to his death? Before she could ask another question, a sudden sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rain, a rhythmic tapping like stone against stone. Clara froze, her flashlight cutting through the cave's shadows. The man's face went pale, and he grabbed the lantern, his eyes wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered. "What's here?" Clara demanded, but he didn't answer. Instead, he backed toward the far end of the cave, clutching the lantern as though it could protect him. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the cave. It wasn't coming from the entrance. It was coming from deeper within, beyond the faint light of the lantern. Clara's instincts screamed at her to leave, to run back to the cliffs and never look back. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not without answers. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Stay here," she told the man, though she wasn't sure he'd listen. "I'm going to see what's making that noise." "No," the man hissed, his voice frantic. "You don't understand. You can't go back there. It'll find you." Clara ignored him, forcing herself to take a step forward, then another. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was beckoning her deeper into the cave. The air grew colder, and the light from the lantern behind her seemed to dim, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. She rounded a corner and froze. The narrow passage opened into a larger chamber, and in the center of the room was a strange, jagged structure, a stone pillar covered in the same spiral markings as the cave walls. But what caught her attention wasn't the pillar. It was the figure standing in front of it, their back turned to her, tapping rhythmically against the stone with a small hammer. "Stop!" Clara called out, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Turn around, slowly." The figure didn't move. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as though they hadn't heard her. Clara's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her flashlight trained on the figure's back. "Turn around," she said again, her voice sharper this time. The figure stopped tapping. Slowly, they turned, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the victim. She'd already seen his body at the lighthouse. This was someone else entirely, their face pale and hollow, their eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "You shouldn't be here," the person said, their voice eerily calm. "You don't understand what you've brought with you." Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the chamber seemed to grow darker. The tapping sound returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the hammer. It was coming from the stone pillar itself, a rhythmic pulse that echoed through the air like a heartbeat. Clara took a step back, her heart pounding as the rhythmic tapping from the stone pillar grew louder, more insistent. The sound didn't just fill the air. It seemed to vibrate through her bones, an unnatural frequency that set every nerve on edge. The pale figure in front of her tilted their head, their unblinking eyes fixed on hers. For a moment, they looked almost human. But there was something off about the way they moved, their jerky, mechanical gestures as if controlled by an unseen force. "You've already heard it, haven't you?" the figure said, their voice carrying an otherworldly calm that sent a chill down Clara's spine. "The signal has called to you." Clara tightened her grip on her flashlight, resisting the growing urge to turn and run. "Who are you? What is this place? And what does the lighthouse have to do with any of this?" The figure smiled faintly, their expression unreadable. "I was like you once," they said, "curious, determined, but some doors aren't meant to be opened. You'll understand soon enough." Behind her, Clara heard footsteps, the frantic shuffle of the man from the cave rushing toward her. He appeared at the chamber's entrance, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "We have to go," he yelled, his voice trembling. "Now, before it's too late." Clara didn't move, her eyes locked on the strange figure before her. "I need answers," she said firmly. "What's buried here? What's causing all of this?" The figure's smile widened, but it wasn't reassuring. "You think the lighthouse was built to guide ships," they said, "but it wasn't. It was built to contain it." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy with unspoken dread. The man behind Clara grabbed her arm, his grip desperate. "He's lying," he said, his voice rising. "Don't listen to him. We need to leave." But Clara shook him off, her focus sharpening. "Who or what is it?" she demanded, stepping closer to the pillar. The tapping had shifted now, faster and more erratic, as though responding to her presence. The spirals carved into the stone seemed to ripple, an optical illusion that made her head spin. "It's been here for longer than you can imagine," the figure said, their voice soft but firm. "Longer than this lighthouse, longer than these cliffs. The keepers thought they could trap it, silence it. But you've seen the signs. It's waking up." The word sent a shiver through Clara, but she refused to let fear control her. "If this thing is so dangerous, why haven't we heard about it before? Why has no one stopped it?" "Because no one leaves," the figure replied simply. Their gaze shifted to the man behind her. "Isn't that right?" The man froze, his face contorting with a mixture of guilt and terror. Clara turned to him, her mind racing. "What is he talking about?" she asked. "You've been here before, haven't you?" The man took a shaky step back, his eyes darting between Clara and the figure. I didn't think it would happen again," he stammered. "I thought it was over." Clara's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" "I didn't have a choice," the man blurted out. "I was desperate. It needed something. Someone. I thought if I gave it what it wanted, it would leave me alone." The figure laughed softly, a hollow, chilling sound. "It never leaves," they said. "It only waits." The air in the chamber grew heavier, the tapping now a relentless pounding that seemed to echo from every direction. The light from Clara's flashlight dimmed, flickering as though the darkness itself was swallowing it. The spirals on the stone pillar glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the sound. Clara's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity and determination rooted her in place. "What happens if it wakes up?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding. The figure's smile faded, their expression growing somber. "It's not about waking up," they said. "It's about finding a way out. And thanks to you, it's closer than ever." Before Clara could respond, the ground beneath her feet shook violently, a deep rumble that sent cracks spiderwebbing across the chamber floor. The stone pillar glowed brighter, its spirals spinning faster, and the tapping became deafening. Clara stumbled, catching herself against the wall as the man shouted something incoherent behind her. The figure stepped back toward the pillar, their movements unnervingly fluid. "You can't stop it now," they said, their voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "But you might survive, if you're willing to make a sacrifice." Clara's mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she couldn't leave without understanding what she was up against. "What kind of sacrifice?" she demanded. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they reached out and placed their hand on the pillar. The chamber was flooded with a blinding light, and for a moment, Clara couldn't see or hear anything but the pounding rhythm, now resonating deep within her chest. When the light faded, the figure was gone, and the pillar's glow had dimmed to a faint, ominous pulse. The man grabbed her arm again, his face twisted with panic. "We have to go," he shouted. "If we stay here, we're dead." Clara hesitated, her mind torn between the overwhelming danger and the burning need for answers. But the ground shook again, more violently this time, and she knew she had no choice. She turned and ran, the man close behind her, as the pounding rhythm of the pillar followed them out of the cave and into the stormy night. Clara and the man burst out of the cave into the howling storm, the lighthouse's beam slicing through the rain in rhythmic flashes. The relentless pounding from the cave still echoed in Clara's ears, even as they scrambled across the slippery rocks toward the cliffs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was charged with some oppressive force pulling them back toward the darkness they had just escaped. "What was that?" Clara shouted over the wind, clutching her flashlight. What did it mean by a sacrifice? The man shook his head, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "It's always been like this," he said, his voice breaking. "It doesn't stop. You think you're free, but it follows you. The only way to escape is to give it what it wants." Clara slowed, turning to face him despite the rain pelting her face. "What exactly does it want?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the lighthouse looming in the distance. "It doesn't want anything specific," he said. "It just needs someone. It feeds on fear, on desperation. That's why it's been quiet all these years. As long as people keep their distance, it sleeps. But when someone digs too deep, when they disturb it..." His words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Clara's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The victim in the lighthouse, the strange figure in the cave, the glowing pillar. All of it pointed to one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just a warning beacon. It was a prison, and something had been trying to break free. "Why didn't you warn anyone?" Clara asked, anger cutting through her fear. "You knew about this, and you didn't stop them from coming here?" The man's shoulders sagged, his expression filled with regret. "Do you think they'd have believed me? I tried, years ago. They called me crazy, said I was seeing things. So I stayed quiet, hoping it would stay buried. But now..." He trailed off, looking toward the stormy horizon. "Now it's awake, and I don't know if it can be stopped." Clara clenched her jaw, her determination hardening. "There has to be a way. That figure in the cave, they said something about containing it. If it was trapped before, we can trap it again." The man shook his head. That was different. The first keepers knew what they were dealing with. They had rituals, symbols, things we don't understand anymore. We're out of our depth. Clara glanced back toward the cave, the rhythmic pounding still faintly audible beneath the storm. Her reporter's instincts screamed at her to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter the risk. But this wasn't just a story anymore. Lives were at stake, including her own. As they reached the base of the lighthouse, the beam above them seemed to flicker, its steady rhythm faltering for the first time. The sight sent a shiver through Clara. If the lighthouse failed completely, whatever was inside might escape for good. "I'm going back in," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "There has to be something in the cave, something we missed. Maybe the markings or the pillar." "You're insane," the man exclaimed, grabbing her arm. "If you go back in there, you won't come out. You saw what it can do." Clara pulled free, her resolve unshaken. "If we don't try, it's not just me at risk. It's everyone. Whatever this thing is, we can't let it leave." Before the man could argue further, Clara turned and ran back toward the cave, the storm battering her with every step. She slipped and stumbled over the wet rocks, but the pull of her mission was stronger than the fear threatening to paralyze her. By the time she reached the entrance, the pounding from within was deafening, as if the cave itself was alive, thrumming with energy. Inside, the air was thick, almost suffocating. Clara's flashlight beam wavered as she made her way back to the chamber. The pillar's glow had intensified, the spirals spinning so fast they seemed to blur into a single hypnotic pattern. She felt the pull of it, an almost magnetic force urging her closer. "I need to understand," she whispered, stepping cautiously toward the pillar. The figure from before was gone, but their words echoed in her mind. "You might survive if you're willing to make a sacrifice." Her gaze fell on the spirals, and she noticed something she hadn't before. Among the carvings were small, crude symbols, hands, eyes, and what looked like human figures. They were clustered around the base of the pillar, and each one seemed to radiate a faint warmth, as if they were alive. Clara reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing one of the symbols. A sudden surge of energy shot through her, and the pounding stopped. The cave fell silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. Clara staggered back, her breathing ragged. She turned to see the man standing at the entrance, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but I think these symbols are part of the containment. The keepers must have used them to seal whatever's in there." The man hesitated, then stepped forward, his eyes scanning the pillar. "If you're right, maybe we can strengthen the seal, but it's dangerous. If we make one wrong move..." "We don't have a choice," Clara said firmly. "Help me." Together, they began tracing the symbols, their movements careful and deliberate. The spirals on the pillar slowed, their glow dimming as the symbols absorbed the energy. Clara felt the air grow lighter with each mark they reinforced, as though the cave itself was responding to their efforts. When the last symbol was complete, the pounding ceased entirely. The pillar's glow faded to a faint ember, and the oppressive force that had filled the chamber was gone. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhaustion washing over her. "It's over," the man said, his voice filled with relief. "At least for now." Clara looked up at him, her expression resolute. "It's not over. Not until the world knows what's down here. People need to understand the danger." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time the truth came out." As they emerged from the cave, the storm began to clear, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. The lighthouse's beam resumed its steady rhythm, a silent guardian once more. Clara knew the fight wasn't truly over, but for now, the threat had been contained. She turned to the man, a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you for helping me. I couldn't have done this alone." He nodded, his expression weary but hopeful. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "If you're going to tell this story, be careful. Some things are better left buried." Clara nodded, her mind already racing with how she would share what she'd learned. As she walked away, she glanced back at the lighthouse, its beam cutting through the fading storm. It wasn't just a beacon anymore. It was a warning, one she vowed to never ignore again.